there where you're not going to hit anything probably, and pull out the cerebrospinal fluid there, but it's the same stuff that's going up and down the spinal cord in that subarachnoid space. So that's just to clarify the difference between the kind of dura that you see down here and this double layered dura that you generally see up in the cranial cavity. Okay. 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 So we go back and try to name these spaces. This is sort of what I sort of said before. There's the outside of this periosteal part is an epidural space, where the bony part of the dura, the periosteal part of the dura, runs into the inner table of bone, and that's generally a potential space because this periosteal layer is essentially glued to the inside of the bone. Then there's the meningeal part, and then there's the subdural space, which is between the meningeal part of the dura and the arachnoid. And then, of course, there's a subarachnoid space in there. Okay, and as I said, this epidural space is a potential space because the periosteum is generally, if not fused, directly adjacent to the cranial bone. You'll notice actually, if you didn't notice on Friday, that when Danny opened up the skulls, sometimes the dura stays with the cranial bone and sometimes it stays with the brain. Sometimes you're actually in the epidural space and sometimes you're in the subdural space. Sometimes you have to try to peel it off to look at some of the features. Okie doke. The same thing we saw before. Okay. However, as I intimated earlier, this meningeal layer of the dura actually does some more complicated things. It doesn't, on the outside of the cranium, yeah, it's pretty much bound to the periosteal part, so you've got this double thickness of dura. But whenever you're not dealing with a flat surface of brain up against a flat surface of internal cranial bone, the dura sometimes takes a different direction, separates from the meningeal part, separates from the periosteal part to dive in between bits and pieces of the brain. And these are called dural infoldings. So let's look at some of them, which you will also look at in lab today. Okay, so all out here where you got a nice flat brain surface and a nice flat cranial bone, the dura there's the periosteal part that stays with the bone, and there's the meningeal part that's related to the brain, but as long as they're have the same shape, all is cool. But when you get a division between the right and left hemispheres, the periosteal part runs the gap and continuous with the periosteal part on the other side, whereas the meningeal part shown here in blue will dive down and cover this hemisphere and that hemisphere. So up here, your dura, in the broadest sense, is made up of a periosteal part and a meningeal part. Down here, this dura, if you want to call it that, is actually made up of two meningeal parts. So this part, this bit of two meningeal layers together here, is referred to as the falx cerebri. A little bit down here, between the cerebral hemispheres and the cerebellum, again, the periosteal part stays with the cranial bone. The meningeal part follows the brain surface around, and then these two fuse together. And this infolding is referred to as the tentorium cerebelli, and it lies between the cerebral hemispheres and the cerebellum. If you were paying attention on Wednesday when we removed the brains for you, this was a bit of a problem because you've got this great big hunk of dura separating the cerebellum from the cerebral hemispheres. So if we didn't cut that out, we would have pulled out the cerebral hemispheres and the cerebellum would have been left behind. Because this dura, as the name implies, is fairly tough stuff. You will also notice, we'll talk about this in a minute, when this meningeal part breaks away from the periosteal part, it leaves a gap. Okay, and we'll show in a minute. These things are filled with blood, and they're referred to as dural sinuses. Ta-da! So, the one up here at the top, where the meningeodura goes down between right and left hemispheres, leaving the periosteal part behind and leaves a space, is referred to as the superior sagittal sinus, because it's right on the midline and it's right at the top of the inside of the brain case. These guys down here, on the edges of the junction between the hemisphere out here and the cerebellum down there, are referred to as the transverse sinuses. These are obviously two-dimensional visions. You'll see them in their grand three-dimensional glory in a few minutes. And this little one stuck right here in the middle is referred to as the straight sinus. Okay, let's look at this from yet another direction. Okay, so here's sort of a three-quarters view, right? We're seeing the sagittal section up here and a horizontal section down there. Okay, so here's this falx cerebri, this folding of the meningeodura between the right and left hemispheres. Okay, and here's that tentorium down here, the infolding between the cerebellum down here and the cerebrum up top. Okay, and you can see that there's bits and pieces of veins lying within these. Which we'll get to in a minute. This one up here is the superior sagittal sinus that I talked about. This one down here is the inferior sagittal sinus. And this one running between the hemispheres up above and the cerebrum below is that little midline thing, the cerebellum below, is what I told you was the straight sinus. Yet another. Okay, this is what you are going to see, because that's essentially the cut that Dan made. And then there was a brain in here, and we lifted the brain out. And so this is what the top of your skulls look like if you pull the cap away. So this is all, these are all some of the, this is that tentorium cerebelli that I mentioned that separates basically the occipital lobe of the brain from the cerebellum, which is hidden down there. And in order to remove the cerebellum with the brain, we sort of had to cut around here so we could lift it out. So this is the tentorium cerebelli intact, and that's the cut. This gap down here around the edge, okay, that's your transverse sinus. This is the straight sinus that was down here in the junction between the two. So that gap, there is a little bit of a gap here, so that's where we took our knives, went in there and started there, and cut, so we can get at the cerebellum. That area around the edge is referred to as the tentorial notch, and that's basically how the brain stem, which is connected to the cerebral hemispheres up here, goes down, and that's the part where the spinal cord starts and obviously goes down all the way, leaving the cerebellum tucked away underneath there, separated from the occipital lobe. There are other little bits of the cerebellum is sort of separated out down here, and we cut this tentorium to get the cerebellum out with the brain. There are other bits of brain that we didn't bother with. For example, the pituitary gland is down here, right, in that sella turcica that we saw when we saw the skulls, but it's covered over by something called the diaphragm celli, and only connected to the brain by this stalk, thing that's known as the stalk of the pituitary. So when we pulled out the brain, we left the pituitary gland still tucked in the sella turcica, because it's hard to get up in there and sever that little thing out. Okay, we got another section right down the sagittal section. Okay, once again, So here's the cut falx. This is the tentorium cerebelli down there. There's also a little infolding here that separates the two halves of the cerebellum, known as the falx cerebelli. It's nowhere near as big as the larger falx up here, but you'll see there's a little bitty bit of dural infolding there. Okay, so back to where we were. So we've identified a whole bunch of these dural infoldings that separate bits and pieces of parts of the brain. This separates right and left hemisphere, the falx cerebri. This tentorium cerebelli separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum down there, and then we've got all these sinuses here. Okay, so again, superior sagittal and straight sinus. We know this is the straight sinus because we're way in the back, just above the cerebellum. However, if we made a saw a little bit further up front, we would see there's extending down through about the upper 2/3 of the right and left hemispheres. There's the falx cerebri, and then there's a little inferior sagittal sinus there that I showed you earlier. Obviously this, fortunately I guess, this falx doesn't go all the way down here because our right and left halves of our brain are connected in the middle, right, by corpus callosum. And here's the pituitary gland sitting down here in the sella turcica, and this dura comes up and sort of actually comes a little closer than it's shown here, so that your diaphragm celli would be running across there. Okay, so here's the sort of the same view we saw before with a little embellishment. Here's the falx cerebri here, the superior sagittal sinus up top, the inferior sagittal sinus down below. Notice that the inferior sagittal sinus comes all the way back and joins the straight sinus. There's also something called the great cerebral vein that drains the veins that are actually in the brain. They dump into the straight sinus. The straight sinus extends posteriorly and joins and forms something called the confluence of the sinuses. So your straight sinus comes into here. Superior sagittal sinus comes into the confluence from the top, and going out on either side are the transverse sinuses, and you'll see that in the brain cases. The transverse sinuses form this sort of S-shaped area going down to the jugular foramen. That's known as the sigmoid sinus. Right where the transverse sinus at the top of the joins the top of the sigmoid sinus, there's a big sinus running across the top of the petrosal bone, a little sinus running across the top of the petrosal bone, known as the superior petrosal sinus. And down below the petrosal bone, there's another one running down to where the sigmoid sinus goes into the jugular foramen, known as the inferior petrosal sinus. And you'll be able to slice those open in the course of your dissection. There's another little one up here known as the sphenoparietal sinus that comes down here. Then there's this area right here in the middle. Okay, that looks like much the same thing. Well, down here in the falx cerebelli, there's a little occipital sinus that lies in this falx and dumps into the confluence of sinuses as well. Okay, so just to back off. Most of those sinuses that I talked about, all this stuff that joins the confluence of sinuses here and goes down through the sigmoid, there's the superior petrosal, and it picks up the inferior petrosal, goes out through the jugular foramen here at the bottom of the skull and goes into the internal jugular vein. However, there are a few connections, which we'll talk about in a minute. There are other connections between, as it were, the outside world here and the cranial circulation. But most of the stuff we've talked about so far ends up in the jugular foramen, goes out through the jugular foramen and dumps into the internal jugular vein. Okay, more of these guys named. Note that there are some other connections, however. For example, the superior ophthalmic vein and the inferior ophthalmic vein, okay, which are in the upper part of the eye and lower part of the eye, are connected to veins on the outside of the face. Okay, so these veins can either drain down through the facial vein, or they can head back into here. There's this big area in the middle known as the cavernous sinus. It's lying on either side of that sella turcica there. We'll see it in cross-section in a minute. It's also connected to this thing I mentioned the other day in the infratemporal region known as the pterygoid plexus of veins. And this pterygoid plexus of veins is connected to bits that are of the facial vein here. It's connected to all these little veins that are coming out of the cavernous sinus. So there's a big connection between the outside world here and the cranial venous drainage in there. This inferior petrosal sinus that I said dumps into the jugular, the internal jugular, right at the jugular foramen where the sigmoid comes in, comes out of the cavernous sinus. Superior petrosal sinus comes out of the cavernous sinus, goes into the top of the sigmoid, comes down. And so there's there's a goodly number of connections between the venous drainage within the cranial cavity and bits of venous drainage in the outside world. And we'll talk about this in a minute, why this can be a problem. Okay, another solve. Chopping the top off, which is pretty much what Dan did. So we haven't gotten to the orbit yet, but when you get into the orbit on Wednesday, you'll see the superior ophthalmic vein coming back here. That little sphenoparietal sinus coming back there. Here's this cavernous sinus. Okay, so these structures are draining into the cavernous sinus, and then from the superior petrosal, the cavernous sinus can come here and join the top of the sigmoid sinus. Comes across there. The inferior petrosal comes down here. It's comes down there. It's connected to the internal jugular vein there. There's a big basilar plexus here. This is your sella turcica. There's your pituitary gland. So this cavernous sinus on this side and the cavernous sinus on this side are connected to each other by this series